Hello, and welcome to the first of our three-part educational series that is designed to explore how using Preserve365 seamlessly complements and enhances what you are doing in Microsoft 365 and SharePoint to streamline how you automate the governance, archiving, transfer, and preservation of critical long-term records. We are so glad to see so many of you join us today from all around the world. My name is Katie Gambone, and I am the Channel Marketing Manager for Preservica. I will be acting as our host today. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We have two handouts available in the handout section, and we invite you to review those. For those of you watching this session on demand, you won't be able to access the handout section, but don't fear. All handouts will be shared in a follow-up email, and they will be available on a landing page that will be published after today's live session. Next up, questions. This is an educational series, and we encourage you to ask your questions by entering them directly in the chat. We have hundreds of guests joining today's call. Because of this, we won't be able to host a live Q&A session, but our team will follow up with you after the event to make sure that your questions are answered. And then finally, there will be a survey at the end of the webinar. We ask that you give us just a minute to please fill this out. It looks like we're already on our speaker slides. So for today's session, I am pleased to say that I'm joined by two of my fantastic colleagues. First up, we will hear from Stuart Reed, Preservica's Chief Product Officer. Stuart will discuss how Preserve365 was created. With a strong background helping world-class brands improve their product offerings and growth, Stuart has been a key player in the creation and delivery of Preserve365. Also speaking today is Sam Butler, our Preserve365 Senior Product Manager. Sam has extensive experience with product management and strategy, and today he's going to take us through a demonstration of the workflow for digitally preserving assets in Microsoft. I'm going to try to advance the screen here. I may need help. Here we go. Okay. So today's webinar is the first in a three-part education series. Module 1, today's module, is focused on protecting and transferring long-term records. We will show you how to ensure the integrity and readability of digital records over decades, how to establish a standard, secure process for the review and transfer of records to the archive, and how to simplify the retrieval of archived records. We ask that you also mark your calendars for modules 2 and 3. Module 2, taking place on May 2nd, will focus on automating the retention and disposition of long-term records. In that session, we'll discuss Microsoft labels and licensing. We'll be joined by guest speaker Rob Bath from Intelligy, and he will highlight how to convert your file plan into purview labels. We'll also discuss automating disposition actions for long-term and permanent records using labels, and advanced automation using Microsoft 365 E, G, or A5 licenses. And then finally, Module 3 on May 16th will focus on getting stakeholder buy-in for your records governance program. We'll discuss assembling your team, who to involve for success. We'll discuss security and IT requirements for ensuring the readability of long-term records, and we'll also highlight some practical success stories. Also, great news, everyone who completes all 3 modules will also receive a certificate plus instructions on how you can add the certificate as a badge on your LinkedIn profile. Achieving the certification will open the door to additional training materials, plus the opportunity to be part of our Microsoft 365/Preserve365 working group, where you can engage and learn from other practitioners. All registrants for today's module are automatically registered for modules 2 and 3. And again, we encourage you and your team to attend all 3 sessions, which are available live and on demand. Preserve365 was created in collaboration with Microsoft product and corporate teams and with input from RMS and IG managers from our early access and preview trial groups. It has been created as a natural complement to existing systems, adding active digital preservation to governance plans and workflows. As you listen to the modules in this education series, we encourage you to get inspired by the ways others work and adapt ideas for their organization. If you want to discuss how this might help support your organization, we encourage you to book some time with our expert team or request a live demo to discuss specific use cases that work for you. So, I advanced a little too far. Here's our agenda for Module 1. First up, Stuart will be talking to us about ensuring the integrity and readability of digital records over decades. And then Sam will provide, like I said, a fantastic demo of how to establish standard, secure processes for the review and transfer of records to the archive, as well as simplifying the retrieval of archived records. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stuart. Take it away, Stuart.
Thanks, Katie, and welcome to everyone that's joining us. It's great to see so many familiar names. So if you are returning from our recent launch webinar, or this is your first opportunity to learn about maximizing your Microsoft 365 investments with embedded preservation, you're all most welcome here at the session. So, as I said, my name is Stuart Reed. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Preserve365, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first of the 3-part education series. Today, we're going to explore protecting and transferring long-term records from within Microsoft 365 so that you can manage the trust, the integrity, the security, and ongoing usability of your critical records and actively minimize the associated data risks. Now, some of you will recognize the current slide from our launch webinar, though I think it's worth highlighting here once again, just to emphasize the point that Microsoft 365 really has become somewhat ubiquitous. In many organizations, it's now the go-to for all manner of document and content types. And it's growing, as you can see from the numbers on the screen here, something in the order of 2 billion documents a day globally. And that's set to continue at an even greater pace over the next few years. So it's really coming into view not just from a records and an information governance perspective, but increasingly at the board level too, as within these vast array of documents of critical records that need to be managed correctly. Not least as based on our research, important records that are bound by regulation, legislation, or other governance make up roughly 1/3 of a typical digital estate. And so the risk of losing or being non-compliant can carry hefty fines and penalties. And this is fast becoming a significant risk factor that must be taken really seriously. And here are some of the examples of the types of documents that make up that 30% across both the public sector, government, and corporate environments. Now, for government users, this could be court records, land, health, infrastructure, or historical records. In a corporate environment, these could include market data, insurance, contractual information, special projects, or brand assets. And there's really 2 significant points that I'd like to make here. Firstly, that there is a broad array of important document types, and they're not just limited to one format. They could be text, they could be pictures, audio, or video files, yet they still need to be managed in a consistent and coherent way. And secondly, the casual observer may be forgiven in thinking that governance and compliance only really applies to those highly regulated industries, but that would not be correct. The fact is that any organization that deals with digital documents, be it those created from paper originals or those created within Microsoft environment itself, will find among them that there are long-term and permanent records. So no one is immune to the rise of so-called digital transformation initiatives. In fact, many of your organizations may be in the midst of digital migration or transformation projects right now, and these are likely to have a direct impact on the critical records that you manage. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that whilst there are significant benefits, of course, to digitization and digital documents pertaining to long-term and permanent records, it provides flexibility and accessibility after all. But all of that somewhat minimized if the associated challenges are not adequately addressed. Now, you see on the bottom left here, Forrester cites the issues of data fragility specifically. So that includes issues such as format obsolescence, data corruption, or other loss. And that's echoed in the recent study that we sponsored with IDC, which found that over half of the respondents consider Microsoft 365 to be their #1 concern for data loss. And as Katie mentioned, that's available for you to download and read at leisure from the handout section in the panel on your PC. So, in the context of growing digital records and many decommissioning projects of legacy systems now choosing Microsoft as its destination for older documents, the result is an ever-increasing number of formats in one location, some of which were never supported by Microsoft in the first place, plus those that are supported. They may be current right now, but they certainly won't be in the next, say, I don't know, 10, 20, 50 years from now. So how do you go about protecting and transferring these long-term and critical permanent records within Microsoft? Well, data archiving would seem to be an obvious answer, but remember, in many instances, the long-term and critical records in question here are likely to be needed on an ongoing basis. These are not simply lock and leave documents. Think of freedom of information requests, think of documents for litigation purposes or brand assets information. In many cases, simple backups or archiving simply isn't enough. These documents need to be easily readable, they need to be trustworthy, and they need to be easily discoverable. And that's where digital preservation becomes the cornerstone for records and information governance to maintain files in a usable state. So always available regardless of the original file format, the ability to prove the authenticity of the original and subsequent copies, and being able to keep all of that together safe for the long term in a way that can be easily accessed as required. And embedding digital preservation as part of your familiar Microsoft workflows unlocks the opportunity to remove data fragility and reduce the risks of data loss. So let's see that in action now. And with that, I'll hand over to Sam to give an in-product walkthrough to explore how protecting and transferring long-term records can be achieved within Microsoft. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Stuart. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. So it's great to see such a large audience on the topic of standard practices for record keeping and born digital content. With so many people representing so many different types of organizations and roles, it's going to be hard to find a relatable common ground to run an education session on. But from a lot of the conversations that I and others in this space have had, we certainly share a goal in wanting to gain ground on managing records reliably in the behemoth that is SharePoint. So with a small amount of time today, what I'm aiming to show you here is a flavour of what's possible in completing a record review and an archival transfer in a way that can bring some focus and scale when capacity is stretched, and you may also have licensing limitations. So the one thing that I will point out today with what I show you is that what we do here should all be possible with at least an E3, G3 or A3 license in Microsoft 365. Bear with me while I get the next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, just back one, please. Great, thank you. So, this statement on this slide here, I'm guessing this could ring true to quite a few, if not most people here. Where are you with your archiving with SharePoint at the moment? Some people aren't doing it because there are limited resources and the priorities are higher elsewhere in the business. Those of you who are doing it are potentially looking at very manual, high risk and inconsistent processes, doing it where you can, because essentially 20% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And while that is true, and both of these statements allude to that in some way, frustratingly, they both still add up to risks, both operationally and strategically. There are storage limit risks, data breach risks, legal and financial penalties. They're all realistic to talk about, and it's not just at the organizational level, it can also be at the individual level as well. Now, some of the common reasons that long-term records are being archived at the moment, and some of the ways that we can tackle this in terms of quick wins. Think about things like project closures, compliance mandates with things like health and safety files, infrastructure documentation, records that may have evidential value, legacy migrations. Some of us are still quite early in the SharePoint journey or in the Microsoft journey, and still have huge backlogs of data from old legacy systems that we haven't yet brought into SharePoint yet, partially for that end reason, for decluttering SharePoint. There are a lot of different things and reasons that we need to archive things within SharePoint, but actually what we need to be looking for, where can we get some quick wins, where can we bring in the right people within the organization to make our lives easier, and actually bringing digital preservation and archiving into SharePoint. So what I'm going to talk through in this example today is one way that we can do this. Like I said earlier, we've got a lot of people representing a lot of different types of organizations, a lot of different roles, but I think one thing that probably, or hopefully feels common, is a project and project closure. Most organizations are running projects at some point or another. Many organizations get to the end of those projects and there are plenty of records of critical value that fall within the data that is passed through SharePoint when those projects are taking place. In the example that I'm going to show you, I've taken on the guise of a large civil engineering organization completing a large civil engineering project. I'm going to be taking on the role of both the archivist and records manager. I know that may ring true to quite a few people in the archival and records management community, where we're doing both of those roles at the same time. And I'm going to talk through something that I've seen in the past when working with a previous organization around how we can take control of archiving at a project's closure. So we're going to do that through liaising with the content owners and making sure that there's a file plan in place so that not just I, but they can identify the records of importance. We can move that content or get it moved into a central archival location. We can standardize some of the metadata that's applied to it, and then we can make sure that the content of value is transferred to a secure archive to be kept, backed up, and in our case, particularly preserved long term. So I'm conscious that, again, for time, we've probably not, I'm condensing a lot into this showcase here, so do please bear with me, but do watch this back on the recording if you need to, and I will take you through the group site that we have for our project. So this should hopefully feel familiar. We're in SharePoint. We have a group site for the construction of a major civil engineering project. I'm going to talk through a few options for standardizing the review and transfer process of records where you're not fully established with Purview or other automation techniques. Again, we'll talk more specifically to how we can automate these processes with retention labels in the next session. So in this scenario, as I've said already, I'm both the records manager and the archivist. I've worked with the head of our project management office to gain a strict mandate to classify any critical records at the conclusion of a project. So at project closure, I've been granted access to the project site, but as you can see here, like most SharePoint sites, it's a bit of a messy place. There's a risk of there being material that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. I've set up an archival review folder for the project team to submit the key requested records to review based on the file plan which I've pinned here. They've been pretty good. They left me some of what I need, but there's some material missing, so we'll need to find that. So the first step is to show the custom fields which I've set up, which enable me to carry out a basic but effective archival review of the files in the site. As an aside, and Stuart is going to talk to the strengths of digital preservation shortly, it's worth me pointing out that our project team are already taking advantage of digital preservation using Preserve365 to access an historic land use permit, which is in an unsupported file format for SharePoint, but it's brought to life immediately when needed using our preservation software. So I've pinned a link to the file plan to the site, so let's take a very quick look at that. I've filtered out the project-specific file plan here, and there are some various rules in place. The two things that we need to focus on, though, are that some items must be preserved, perhaps for future decisions or strategy planning, and for long-term maintenance, but others only need to be kept for a short period. So if we go back to the site, and we'll look at what I've done to speed up the process of me running through this for a records review. So I've condensed this down to show you, but the whole thing really took me about 2 hours to set up and complete. I've created 4 additional fields here to give me a basic context for a tighter records management procedure. The first is the file plan. I've created a single select option based on what the file plan is. I've put 4 options in here, but you may have more or less, so there is some setup here required to do this. But as you can see, I can make a selection. Next up, as the reviewer, this is a person or a review group column, linking back to the original individual who carried out the review. The date reviewed column is pretty self-explanatory. I'll set this on the date that I carry the review out. And then finally, I've put a disposition review field in here. Another date field, which I've populated manually for this, but it could be easy to use SharePoint's formula syntax, for instance, to base the date of the disposition review on the file plan that you've selected, although I'm conscious that that is a more advanced action to take. While I don't demonstrate it in here either for time, it's worth pointing out as well that a useful suggestion is to ensure that these dates are adhered to could be to use Power Automate. So we could create an automation which can send an email, for instance, outlining that the file's due a disposition review when the current date approaches the review date. So I've carried out a base review at the high level, and there are 4 items which I've marked as needing preservation. So to start, I'm going to move them into a new location. I'll skip the first one for time and repetition, but our contracts and agreements have a specific place in the organization's SharePoint site where they're kept. So I'm going to move those to the project site and they'll be dealt with later. The other files, they're just victims of a typical SharePoint disorder, and they need to be gathered with other archival material. So I've already looked at them, and having worked with the project manager and the engineering lead for some context, I know that these are critical files, and I'm going to move them to my archival review folder. Now, one thing I've noticed in my archival review folder is that I'm missing the meeting minutes. So we're going to bring those in with a quick site search. And I can see, going back to the documents, that we have a meeting minutes folder right here. So I'm going to move those back into the archival review site. And now everything looks quite clean. So now they're in my review folder and I've completed the review separately. I'm going to apply the metadata which confirms the outcome of my archival review. I'm again going to use the grid edit feature here because it's much easier to do this in a tabular way. It's a little bit more akin to Excel. But all of this material should be retained indefinitely according to the file plan, which, although I don't need to put a disposition review in here because we're retaining indefinitely, for good measure, I'm going to review its relevance 6 years from the project closure, which Freeze will assume is today's date. You can also see the ease of adding data in bulk here by copying and pasting into the rows. And that's the key metadata for the archival review that you can see here now completed. So I've got a couple of options. There are a few routes which require me potentially downloading or zipping the files for them to be transferred to a safe location. However, as we've discussed, the risks of uncontrolled data are quite evident here. A lost laptop, not deleting the files from my local machine, corruption in transit, all of these could lead to data breaches. So instead, the button that we've got here shows that I've got Preserve365 installed in this site, and it's much easier, faster, and secure for me to bridge this gap with direct transfers to the archive. It gives you a couple of options, but for this case, I'm going to move this so that past users are able to search for the preserved records once they're added and complete. And it's as simple as this, really. I'm going to highlight the material due to move, click archive, click move, and then send it on. And the transfer completes while we carry on. So I'll trace the progress through this archive meter until the folders have gone, signaling a complete transfer. And in case it wasn't clear, though I've only moved one folder here, it will transfer the entire folder structure underneath, meaning I've carried out a transfer of around about 75 files and folders here in one click. So we know that that is much faster, much more secure than just downloading them. And how do I know that that transfer is complete? Well, I can search for the archival material. We have a specific search filter in SharePoint for all of our content being kept in the preservation archive, and I will see the archive content available to view in a readily available and readable format. If this was an obsolete file type, for instance, like the land permit that we looked at quickly earlier, the ability for me to access that immediately readable file is hugely valuable to me as the records manager and the archivist, to the record owner, and to the legal and compliance teams who might all want to call on it. So everything that needs to be preserved now is secure in a preservation archive where each asset and all of its metadata is going to remain preserved for as long as it's needed to be, with a readily available version to call on. And I haven't once left SharePoint. For what's left, so the shorter term records which I classified earlier, I've got a few options here. I could retain them in SharePoint, sure. Knowing that they're classified now, they have record keeping metadata assigned to them, sure. That keeps them in place, that keeps them accessible. However, as I mentioned already, SharePoint isn't purpose-built for a repository. It's a content sharing platform. So keeping this stuff in place, as your IT team will know, is expensive, and it risks them being shared with somebody it shouldn't or being tampered with. Another option that we've got from a Microsoft perspective is actually utilizing cheaper storage archival options, such as Microsoft 365 Archive. That'll archive the entire site into a colder storage state, and IT will be happy to hear that that is much cheaper. And it allows me to access the data through a process called rehydration in as little as 24 hours. That's much safer, more operationally advantageous, but it still has some flaws. For instance, you'll need to put in a request through your IT admin to retrieve that data, and the rehydration process costs money to complete. You may even need to do that just to get one file from the entire site. So what I'm going to do instead is utilize an option and couple it with Preserve365 to show you how the two platforms are better together. So I'm utilizing Preserve365's copy option here to maintain the files in SharePoint so that they can be moved to the Microsoft 365 archive and keep them in a colder storage section, but also archive and preserve them with Preserve365 so that we have an immutable record representation that we can access immediately in case we ever need to call upon it. That also makes a great disaster recovery backup option if anything happens to the site while it's an archive. And as you can see here, everything that's been archived is visible. This isn't just useful to document libraries though. We know of users who maintain their projects with lists in Microsoft 365. And as part of this project, our team has done the same, maintaining the issue tracker in a list which allows the attachment of files and lots of different custom types of metadata. As a record, there's a huge amount of context and complexity here. We at Preserve could call them multi-part assets, and Preserve365 handles them relatively similarly in the sense that they're kept together, but they are preserved individually. So again, I'm going to send this to the preservation archive. This list, we've got an issue tracker list here with all the issues that were kept within the project. And we are going to take all of the metadata, all of the attachments, and all of the associated files. I think my recording here though is paused. Aaron, would you mind just checking on that for me, please? Just give me a second to break for water, thank you. Okay, so a few months have passed from this point, and the point that I wanted to get to here, although we've jumped a little bit quickly, is that essentially we need to go back and look for a land clearance permit after a legal challenge on the construction of our bridge. The main detail here is that we shouldn't have moved earth within 200 meters of a nearby wetland, but because, well, we have a copy of the permit on site, What we didn't have a copy of was an email that our site manager is adamant exists that says that we could move earth within 150 meters of the wetland. Now, because we've archived this list, we've not just got the list metadata, we've also got an important attachment with this list as well, as part of it being a multi-part asset, which is an email which points out that we did have permission to do this within 150 meters of the wetland, and actually absolves our organisation of any responsibility from the claim that was made to us from the Environment Agency. And this is the real importance of the work that we do as archivists and records managers to maintain immutable records that are together with context, not just with the metadata, but with the attachments as well. Strict archiving and preservation plans bear their fruit at times like this, and it's to protect organisational heritage, property, and credibility. I'm conscious that that was a hugely, very quick whistle-stop tour of how we could manage risk with a standardized process and a secure transfer within Microsoft 365, but I hope that that was useful to you, and I would suggest you going back and watching that again if you get the chance. Essentially, standard metadata, gaining approval from within members of your organization, particularly in projects, is a great way of getting a quick win and being able to push, I would say push the agenda, but I mean fight the good fight for archiving and records management. And then having a means of being able to do a secure transfer within Microsoft 365 will be a huge benefit to your chief records officers, your heads of information security, and your IT teams, knowing that you aren't going to be pulling files into local environments to then have to re-upload. It's a huge risk of tamperability and also of corruption in the file format itself. We've also seen legacy system content being consolidated by being able to access the files in SharePoint, even if they're obsolete. You know now that you can keep your long-term content alive with a digital preservation strategy, as well as just an archiving strategy. Being able to trust the authenticity of those records as well with tamper evidence, which is shown through the archiving of lists, the metadata, all the content and the attachments within those two, and then being able to let permitted users quickly find ways to access those readable records through search. In the next session, we'll look at how you can maximize an investment within Microsoft using the governing actions of Microsoft retention labels. But I hope that this run through was useful to you. I'm now going to pass back to Stuart so that he can talk a little bit more just to the immutability of the records that we touched on just briefly there, looking at active digital preservation. Thanks, Stuart. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam. Okay, so you saw the power and significance of embedding digital preservation within the SharePoint experience to provide ready access to an array of long-term and permanent records for mission-critical activities. Now, as you saw, the user was able to get all the information they needed without worrying about the technology or needing to go anywhere else. So, let me take you through the opportunity to share some of the process that sits behind the scenes that makes what you saw earlier from Sam possible from a preservation perspective. Now, as Sam highlighted, the variety of digital content types is increasing, and for the example he used around potential litigation, it was crucial that the records were trustworthy and readable, and the records in question could quite feasibly have been decades old. And it makes no difference if the digital asset is a single file or a complex asset made up of multiple files, like an email in the attachment example we used earlier. If just one element becomes obsolete or corrupted over time, digital assets can quickly become unreadable. Now, regular archiving systems don't support the migration of files, meaning risk from unreadable data becomes higher over time. And whilst basic digital preservation systems can manually migrate files to newer formats, they can fail to maintain the integrity of the asset by placing the original and the newer files together in the same folder. So to overcome this, we are utilizing full record preservation, and we're protecting not just the content of the record, but maintaining the full context of all of its parts, the multi-part asset that Sam touched on earlier. Managing this as a single entity, as inferred by Sam in the earlier example. Now, individual files can be migrated and managed independently. The original is always retained, and subsequent file migrations are tracked, and that the latest access and preservation copies are always made available, as we saw in the earlier example. And it is this technology that is now embedded within Microsoft with the advent of Preserve365, allowing you to actively protect and indeed transfer your records all directly from within SharePoint. And if we zero in on how this adds value in the long term, it consists of three main parts. You could have millions of files that you're managing, so preservation that is both automated and continuously checking for the latest formats to maintain usability is essential, and it's paramount that it remains authentic and secure. First, by analysing the content of the whole record, identifying its component parts, checking for viruses and applying tamper-evident technology. Then, where obsolete components are identified, migrating these to newer and supported versions to ensure it becomes or maintains usability, whilst keeping the original intact, and then keeping it under continuous review to make sure that it stays fully usable and available. And all of this happens seamlessly within the Microsoft environment. So there's nothing that the user has to do. There's nothing they have to check. There's nothing they have to maintain. They simply access the files that they need on demand, as we saw in the earlier example, and all from within the Microsoft interface. And to reiterate the point that both Katie and Sam made earlier, what we've shown you with Preserve365 has been built in active collaboration with both the records and governance community to solve real-world challenges, as we saw earlier, with data management. And we've also been working with Microsoft themselves, collaborating with them to augment the value of 365 with the power of embedded preservation for a seamless, trustworthy, and a scalable way to govern long-term and permanent records. So thank you very much, and Katie, back to you.
Great. That was a lot of fantastic information that you shared today. So a huge thank you to Stuart and Sam for presenting, and also to all the other members of the Preservica team who are working on this education series. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to today's attendees as well. We hope that you found this information useful. And again, we encourage you to join us for Module 2, Automating the Retention and Disposition of Long-Term Records on May 2nd. So while you are waiting for Module 2, though, I might need some, here we go. We have some exciting ways for you to engage with Preserve365 to learn more. So you can experience Preserve365 for yourself with our interactive tour. This easy option includes a guided experience that features a demonstration of specific features, including automating the governance, archiving, and digital preservation of long-term and permanent Microsoft 365 records. Each example only takes about a minute. Next, you can also see how Preserve365 works for your organization with an in-depth demo from our expert team. The individualized demo is a great way for you to ask questions and get colleagues together to start talking about ways to improve your long-term records archiving. And then finally, you can also just schedule a one-on-one session to get your questions answered by talking with one of our expert team members. So next slide. Okay, last call for questions. Again, we ask that you please enter any questions you have into the chat feature on your control panel. Our team is collecting all of the questions, and again, we'll follow up with you after today's session. And then finally, well, we're kicked out, but again, a huge thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, all recordings and handouts will be available on the education series landing page later today. Also, I just ask that you give us a few minutes to complete the survey as you leave the webinar today. We really appreciate this feedback, and it helps us to provide the best programming possible for you. So with that, we'll end today's webinar. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.